Welcome to the state of blockchain security. In case we have not met, my name is Peter, and I stumbled upon this field of blockchain security accidentally about 5 years ago, and I'm very excited to share with you like what it is, what are the threats, what is this, why is this so near and dear to me? Um, in case you're not familiar, it's a brand new security field with a mission of securing and defending the cryptocurrency ecosystem. And you can think of cryptocurrency ecosystem when you read about it in the news, people buying dogs and JPEGs and all sorts of fun stuff. But to me, it's about the Ukrainian and Russian refugees escaping war zones and, being able to preserve their livelihoods, even when they're going through, border control that takes everything away by just memorizing 12 words. That's all it takes. That's not something that my family was able to do. That's why, to me, if I spend my time making the system safe and sound, and it saves at least one family out there to preserve their livelihoods, it's worthwhile. And I invite you to join me. I have a whole lot of content for you, so I'll talk fast. There'll be hopefully some time to ask questions. But I really want to give you a map for this brand new industry. Explain what are the unique threats, what are the unique opportunities for you to build on, and let's see, maybe you'll find it fun enough to explore more. So with that, first, let's talk about what is the difference between cryptocurrency ecosystem and the traditional security ecosystem. The best way to look at it is just look through the economics of it. So when we talk about exploitation with traditional security, there are about 1,000 or so incidents that happened in the last year. On the blockchain side, there were about 294. So it's obviously a much smaller industry, so there are less hacks. Where it gets interesting is the dollar amounts involved in those compromises. So the $4.6 billion value that I calculated is pretty hard to find because you can't go to some report from Verizon or Mandiant or anyone else out there that says, you're like, this is how much money was actually stolen. What they concern themselves more is like, this is how many emails were compromised, so social security numbers. There's no actual dollar value they can assign there. So I extrapolated based on the report from IBM, which counts about $4 million per incident. Things are different on the blockchain side, where because of the nature of it, because it's an open ledger, you know exactly how much was in the treasury of a company that was compromised, and suddenly it's not there. So from that, I could see $3.7 billion that was in treasuries of cryptocurrency businesses, and now it's gone. So what that means is that per incident for businesses, a single incident is worth not just $4 million in traditional security, but $12 million. This is basically, it's a life-changing event for a company. Like if it loses $12 million, a large chunk of them shut down after the fact. So it is critical for businesses to shore up the security. Let's look at the attacker perspective. Why are they so interested in hacking crypto assets? Same thing on traditional side, 1,000 incidents. The way that you can calculate attacker profits, that's really hard too. The most profitable like cash cow of traditional compromise is ransomware. So ransomware, $450 million was stolen according to Chainalysis. If you're stealing, emails and all that stuff, we saw in a phishing talk yesterday, you're selling millions of records for pennies per 1,000 or million records. So I would say like, I'm giving it like a big chunk, like big variance here, it's about $2 million per incident. That's the attacker profit. On the blockchain side, it still is 12 million because the exact amount that left the company's treasury now ends up in the attacker's pocket. So naturally, a lot of bad actors, a lot of traditional bad actors, nation states, they did the same math and they said, well, we can spend all this time trying to go out our way, steal identity and try to go on the black market, try to sell there, or we can just steal the actual cash. So it makes sense for them to really target this, this field. So that's the math breakdown. Let's talk about, before we dive into specific threats, let's talk about on a very high level what constitutes a cryptocurrency ecosystem from the defender and attacker side. So of course there's the blockchain, like that's the underlying technology. This is the consensus mechanism that allows you to do transaction in a decentralized fashion with no one being able to say no to you. Those blockchains communicate with nodes, which are specialized servers which enforce the consensus. So that making sure that whatever the ledger state that appears on one side is the same on the other. Wallet software is the client software which communicates with those nodes. So that's what you and I would install on our machines. Smart contracts. So those are tiny little programs that run on all the nodes and allow you to implement things like banking and I guess decentralized banking and loans and all of that good stuff without any central control. There are CeFi businesses, that's centralized finance. So think of exchanges. And DeFi, that's the most exciting part, decentralized finance. That's you're building up whole banks and whole ecosystems, financial ecosystems, without any single entity exerting control on you. And of course, there are users which interact with all of that. With that, let's look at what's happening with this model. So the slide shows you how much was lost just this quarter, in the last 3 months. So on the user, CeFi, and blockchain side, that's around $20 to $30 million lost. The real losses are in the DeFi, $390 million stolen in the last few months. And we can give you this number with precision because we can observe the projects actually getting compromised and losing that exact amount. And this is where we're going to focus for most of the talk. This is where attackers are most likely going to focus because they're transitioning from exchanges and other compromises to DeFi. And so we as security professionals should focus on defending as well if we want to contribute to this ecosystem. So let's begin with the user and wallet security first. So just on a very high level, we have our users who communicate to the client software, which is usually a browser extension or mobile app. The wallets communicate to dApps. If you're not familiar, it's just a website. Within that website, there's some embedded code which can talk to those extensions. You can talk to your wallet software. And then wallets take commands from the dApp, like, hey, I want to swap some ETH, and I want to send it over to the blockchain. To visualize it, imagine a wallet software. I'm biased here, Coinbase wallet here. You navigate to a dApp. So this is Uniswap. You're trying to switch. You can try to swap one ETH for some USDC. You can't do, it's no longer 2000. It dropped in the last couple of days. You say, go for it. Your wallet accepts a command. You approve that command to perform the swap. And then it shows up on the ledger. So that's a blockchain explorer where you can see all of the transactions. And that gets us to the first and one of the worst user threat vectors out there. It's called approval phishing. You can imagine that if you navigate to a malicious website, and oftentimes they entice you with some kind of airdrop. It's a free tokens that you can claim because you're you, and just for you, we'll give you some free stuff. Well, little do you know that when you navigate there and you click on, hey, let's retrieve those tokens, you'll be presented with an approval screen. But that approval screen doesn't authorize you receiving those tokens because of how limited the UX is. Oftentimes you approve things which end up sending all your money on the ledger to the bad guys. And then you end up with an empty wallet and a sad face. And you say, well, couldn't users be better? Well, not really. Like Kevin Rose is one recent hack. And if you're familiar, Kevin Rose, the Dig fame, he's been in the crypto ecosystem for a while. So he's an experienced user, OG we call them. And he was still tricked into losing $1 million worth of NFTs, the squiggly lines. Yes, it's worth $1 million. But the idea is like, what are the limitations of wallet software out there that still tricks even more experienced users? By the way, you'll see QR codes. I know we are at the security conference and you're not supposed to click on QR codes, but you know who I am and you know where to find me. This is just a way for you to get more information and more research on this particular subject. So if it really sounds interesting, check it out. Let's talk about zero transfer phishing. So that's another attack vector. The best way to understand it, imagine that you called your bank and then you want to call your bank again. And the best way to do this is you look at the phone call history, right? Who do you call? You remember like the phone number started with 555 something, and I'm going to call this number again. Well, imagine that if attackers could inject a number into your call history, which also start with 555, what are the chances of you accidentally dialing the bad number as opposed to the original one? And that is exactly what attackers figured out how to do. They inject a transaction with an address which looks closely like your original one, but just slightly different. you approve a transaction, a transfer there, and now your money's gone. So this is an example of a zero transfer fish transaction. You'll see the first 3 characters, 5 EC, are the same, but then the rest is different. So these are called vanity addresses. You can brute force until you can calculate an address which is similar enough, but surprisingly, it's successful enough that on the Ethereum blockchain, almost $20 million were lost to this hack in the past few months. Okay, so to summarize the state of user and wallet security, wallet UX needs improvement. It's a new field. People are barely trying to get this going, and unfortunately, bad guys are also taking advantage of that. Malicious transaction and address detection is a huge growth opportunity. Think of it like a firewall or antivirus product, but for cryptocurrency users that tells them, like, don't go there. You know, this Chrome big red screen that you get when you go to a phishing site? We need that. If you're a builder, you want to create something new, this is an amazing opportunity. The other part is investigations. If someone compromises your wallet, who are you going to call? There are no Mandiants or CrowdStrikes or anyone else that you can call. It's volunteers. Volunteers right now sit down and spend hours and hours of their personal time to investigate and shut down these hacks. So again, there are opportunities for more professional services there. No talk about blockchain security would be complete without exchanges. So let's talk about exchange security. Again, I'm not going to focus on more traditional hacks like, your server gets compromised or someone somewhere downloaded malware. We'll talk about blockchain-specific threats. And for that, just think of users communicating with some kind of exchange backend over API. The key element, and then the exchange will forward on whatever it needs to the actual blockchain. So they're an intermediary. The key thing to keep in mind are the kind of asset storage that is embedded inside. We distinguish them between hot storage, hot wallets, and cold storage. Hot wallets, think of them as live data that is accessible for users to immediately, quickly retrieve, swap, and so on. And then you have cold storage. Cold storage was introduced because exchanges get hacked. So if you do get hacked, you probably don't want to lose everything. You probably want to keep the majority of your assets somewhere offline, which is very difficult to retrieve, requires all sorts of steps. That is the common practice, at least, for most exchanges. This gives you just some idea of how exchange compromises go over time. And 2022 would have been amazing if not for this one exchange, which I'll cover in detail shortly. You can probably guess who it was. But first, the attack vectors on exchanges. Hot wallet compromise is by far $500 million stolen in the last year and a quarter. Other things like server compromise, credentials theft. Credential theft is more like API key theft that was popular last year, where one exchange like IRA Financial was relying on API keys stolen from it that were used to access Gemini for cold storage. Server compromise is more related like incidents with Bitcoin ATM machines, like their whole info got hacked, private keys stolen. Application logic misconfiguration, there are smaller attack vectors. They're more concerned with like incorrectly set exchange rates that attackers took advantage of to arbitrage. Okay, let's talk about FTX. If certain someone was not thinking about rehypothecation, they would have at least implemented cold storage. And as we found out from the bankruptcy docs, those $432 million that were stolen, maybe some portion of them would have stayed. From Chapter 11 bankruptcy docs, no security staff, not using cold storage, keys, private keys stored in clear text, multi-sig wallets stored in the same text file in clear text. So like really wild, like I can't believe this was happening. Stolen assets were extracted, went through chip mixer, North Korea favorite, not sure who it was, but one of the indicators, and it's gone. So this is an extreme example of an actor who was extremely careless. Let's talk about North Korea. Threat actor APT38, North Korean Lazarus Group, was attributed to stealing $1.7 billion so far in the last, I guess, 5 years or so, that they did the math that I showed you earlier and said, like, wow, we should really start stealing crypto. Their techniques that they use are more traditional. Like they don't create like O-Day vulnerabilities and do all sorts of like crazy stunts. Same old malware, spear phishing, supply chain attacks. Their latest invention is that they apply for jobs at crypto companies saying like, hey, hire me, I'm an American developer, malicious insider, you wanna, anyways, people have like all sorts of weird YouTube recordings of the conversations. I invite you to research that. So overall, the state of exchange security, hundreds of millions are lost. That said, those hundreds of millions are still 14% of total losses in the crypto ecosystem. So you definitely should, if you're interested as a career within the space, exchange security is great. What I'm going to talk about next is where the real losses occur, though. Supply chain attacks, spear phishing, traditional attack vectors are very much applicable. And whatever security professional you're going to talk to, like who is their boogie person that they wake up in the middle of the night sweating, it's North Korea. They're thinking of Uncle Kim. So the state of protocol security. Protocol security, here we're talking about blockchains, the actual blockchain protocols. Again, on a high level, you have a bunch of nodes. They all communicate the current state to each other. They like this transaction occurred. Everyone should be notified. They get rid of bad states by implementing a variety of consensus mechanisms, from proof of work, proof of state. I invite you to learn more about that. But the key element for our purposes are the layers. There's the execution and consensus layer. The consensus layer concerns with making sure that the ledger state that they obtain is legitimate and valid across the ecosystem. This is agreeing on what transactions are present. And then we have the execution state. And I mentioned smart contracts previously. This is the layer that makes sure that you execute those tiny little programs in a secure fashion and no funny business occurs. Because it does. If we look back in history, let's go back to 2021, the majority of attacks were on the consensus layer. So raise of hands, how many are familiar with 51% reorg attacks? Quite a few, okay. For those you're not sure about, it's basically the ability to trick the system, make a deposit to an exchange, swap it out for something else, and then cheat, and somehow that deposit like as if never happened. Node vulnerabilities back then were only $5 million. It was just starting out. I was afraid it's going to happen, but it did. The vast majority of compromises today are as a result of node exploitation. So $700 million. And then on the consensus side, there are still consensus level exploits, but they changed. They evolved into something called MEV vulnerabilities. I'll talk about it in a second. So let's talk about our first attack vector on the protocol side, MEV boost block leakage exploit. What is MEV? MEV stands for maximally extracted value. It was previously called minor extractable value, but it's not as politically correct, so we don't say that anymore. Think of it this way. Forget about crypto. Let's talk about general finance. You're familiar with Flash Boys, the book, where people were buying data servers close to exchanges to make sure they can front-run legitimate traders? Same story. Advanced traders in the cryptocurrency, they figure like, hey, if I'm going to pay this little bribe to a node operator and I'm going to ask them to include my transaction just before another transaction or right after or around it, it's called a sandwich attack, I'm going to make some profit. And the whole industry was immediately born where professional traders would bribe their way to include a transaction at a strategic place. Now, when it was disorganized in the beginning, you can imagine that node operators could also front-run the front-runner traders. Like if they see a profitable trade, why not include your own? Or why not drop that suggested trade and keep all the money for yourself? So it was a mess. And to address that, a more democratic system was introduced where there's a proposer node, which is completely blind to those highly profitable blocks that are proposed by builders. And proposers, their only job is to see, hey, what's the biggest bribe from this particular block? I will choose that one and forward on to a relayer. A relayer now can unwrap that block and forward onto a node to actually mine. And all of this works great. Proposers cannot produce malicious blocks based on what input they get, as long as they're not aware of what are the transactions in that obfuscated block. Except for April 3rd. On April 3rd, someone found a vulnerability in this package that facilitates this called MEV boost, where they figured out if they transmit a broken block, the relayer will take it, fail, but it will still expose all of the transactions. So what this one malicious proposer did, effectively, they leaked the contents of the block, they included their own transactions in there, or rearranged the transactions, and stole $25 million from these advanced traders, MEVs. And by the way, we're not talking about people manually putting together blocks. These are actual machine code, fully automated bots that generate those every few seconds. On the node execution side, so node exploitation, BSC Token Hub is a perfect example. The way that it works is that you can imagine, like, you don't want to implement everything as a virtual machine. You want to probably embed some highly optimized code, like to calculate hashes, Merkle tree verification, and other things deep inside the node itself. So it's running in Go code, not in some kind of virtualized machine, so you can run it fast. Such was the case with the Binance Smart Chain, where they decided to implement IAVL Merkle tree verification. Key element. This is used to produce like a claim ticket to the node, say, hey, someone is asking me for $100 million and they're offering this verification receipt. Is this thing legit? And the node is supposed to say, yeah, it is legit. Go ahead, give them the money. Well, someone was able to find an exploit, and if you look carefully at the source code here, this if-else statement misses a case where both sides of a tree are defined. They were expecting only one side. Effectively, I'll give you some more time to look at it, but effectively, you can sneak in an extra proof in next door to the legitimate one. That's exactly what the attackers did. They were able to steal $586 million, $500 million. This is a down market. That happened a year ago, that would have been the first billion-dollar hack. From the Binance Smart Chain Token Hub, they effectively created a ticket, a claim ticket that said, hey, you owe me 2 trillion Binance tokens, and the smart contract here obliged because the node proof verification was vulnerable. So to zoom out, the state of protocol security, no one does 51% of reorg attacks anymore. That's in the past. I really was wondering if governance and staking, proof of stake attacks would take over, but that didn't really happen. The real game here are virtual machine and node exploitation. So if you want to spend time researching for vulnerabilities, that's where you're going to find the most deadly bugs. And that gets us to the state of DeFi security. This is by far the largest field, so let's spend more time on this. So just to give you a mental picture, DeFi protocols, we have users. They're interacting with dApps. So these are these web applications where you can talk to, let's say, a lending protocol. dApps talk to wallets. So that's your interface to the blockchain. And then you have blockchains that communicate with smart contracts. This is the divide where the DeFi ecosystem begins. Those smart contracts can implement all sorts of things, from lending, borrowing protocols, swaps. You can leverage your investments and flash loans, all sorts of fascinating things I invite you to explore. Smart contracts do not exist in vacuum. In fact, it's a feature that they all stack and interact with each other. It's called composability. One particular type of smart contracts that I want to talk about are called oracles. They provide the ability for blockchains to receive external data, or they provide information like what is the current exchange rate, like, if you're trying to swap ETH for USDC, what's the current price? And of course, we have to talk about admins. So if you compromise administrative keys, which happen, that control smart contracts, you can empty whatever treasuries are inside those smart contracts or do all sorts of interesting things. So this is kind of a limited model. I just included just enough to talk about a couple of use cases that I'm going to discuss. So let's talk about chain bridge hacks. And the reason why these particular hacks are so relevant is that there are just a few of them, but they're so costly. You saw that Binance Smart Chain compromise. That was a bridge compromise, and it was immediately $500 million, poof, gone. The reason why bridges exist is that we no longer live in a world where there's a Bitcoin network, an Ethereum network, and that's about it, maybe a couple more. There are hundreds of chains out there. So if you're a user and you purchase some token on, let's say, Ethereum, but you want to do transactions on another chain, maybe they offer cheaper transaction fees or different security characteristics or different speed of transactions, whatever the reason, you want to transfer your tokens from one chain into another. You do this using bridges. The way the bridges work, imagine that you have some USDC on the Ethereum network. You will use bridges on both sides of the network, in this case it's Polygon, to transfer that asset. The way that it works, you send the USDC to the bridge takes in your USDC, holds on to it in the liquidity pool, And then from there, it mints a new USDC token on the other side, which is sent to you. Now you'll immediately see, wow, those bridges, they hold on to all that USDC and other tokens that they receive from users. You can see why attackers are interested in this, because they hold on to a lot of it. That's where the huge liquidity pools holding on to all the user tokens there. And that gets us to the first exploit, the wormhole compromise. And this one is just so fascinating from so many directions. Similar to the Binance Smart Chain hack that we discussed earlier, there was an issue with the proof verification. Someone was able to craft an account with a specific characteristic. Check out the QR code for more details. Effectively, they were able to cheat and claim more assets from the bridge that they were allowed to. In this case, $325 million worth. They stole it on the Solana network, transferred over to Ethereum. But this is where it gets really interesting. So on the wormhole, a year later, normally when you see what attackers do after those compromises, they use Tornado Cash, or they find some exchange without a KYC requirement and they start swapping it, laundering, and so on. Not this one. This guy was really wanted to extract maximal value. So what they did, as a true degen, like just people who are like doing crazy things on these networks, as a true degen, they decided to take 120,000 ETH and put it up as collateral on Oasis network. They took that as a collateral, and then they borrowed a whole bunch of RETH and staked ETH. And if you're not familiar, these are just Ethereum tokens, but they're interest-bearing Ethereum tokens. So not only did they steal 120,000 ETH, now they're earning interest on what they stole. So they're like really cashing in here. Except because they did this lending thing, there's always a risk of your loan going underwater. And we'll cover lending protocols shortly. If your loan goes underwater, you may get liquidated. That means you may lose all of your collateral. And to prevent that, there exist specialized bots. They're called stop-loss bots, which you delegate access to your token. So if your loan is just about to go underwater, these bots will step in, liquidate your loan before you lose anything. The one thing the attackers did not figure for is that the stop-loss bots were also controlled by the Oasis network. And the Oasis network had admin keys for that bot. That means they could potentially change it in such a way that they could reclaim those funds. And that's exactly what happened. They upgraded a bunch of white hats, figured out that, hey, these guys are going full degen. They just deposited and they delegated access to their tokens to this new contract, which you have admin keys for. Could you maybe hack your contract and steal those back? Sure. Upgrade went through. They stole those assets from the attacker, who was probably sitting there like, what the hell just happened? I got hacked. They restored the loan, took back the original ETH plus actual 17,000 extra ETH that they earned in interest, and gave it back to the wormhole protocol. This type of stuff only happens in DeFi. This is the Wild West, guys. This is just one example of white hat attacks. Again, there are a lot of volunteers that sit there and they constantly monitor and watch for attacks on, it's a public ledger, so you can see the attack live happening in front of your eyes. So a lot of white hats, what they started doing is that they actually, the second they see the first transaction of a hack, they will swoop in and start hacking the protocol themselves. And then they'll give whatever money that they recovered back to the protocol. So there's a whole interesting, and the best part is that once again, you can see all of this happening live in front of your eyes, transaction after transaction. Pretty fascinating. Okay, let's talk about lending protocols. So lending protocol, I guess, why do lending protocols even exist first? Like imagine you have $1 million worth of ETH and you want to buy a house, not in San Francisco, far away. So your one option is you take your 1 million ETH and then you sell it. You pay 30–40% in taxes. Now you have around like maybe 600K. So you got your down payment, you got a mortgage. Cool. The other way you can do this is you can take your $1 million worth of ETH and, well, and you can put it up as collateral, and you put it up as a collateral and withdraw $1 million worth of USDC. So now instead of paying your interest rates to some mortgage company, Fannie Mae or whatever, you can actually pay to this lending protocol, which is probably a few percent. It's decentralized. They're not going to confiscate your mortgage if they're pissed at you or something like that. And that's great. You just got a house, $1 million. That's cool. Lending protocols, when they give you this loan, internally they keep your collateral, and they also keep track to make sure that the ratio between the collateral and how much USDC they gave you remains at least a 1-to-1 ratio. The reason they need to do this is because this is all permissionless. They don't have your KYC. There are no mechanisms that they can go and find you like, hey, give me back my loan, or institute a legal action. That's not the whole point of DeFi. But imagine a scenario that within this ratio, what if ETH drops like it did in a couple of days, and now your loan is underwater? Well, lending protocols, they implemented a mechanism where they get rid of bad loans once they go underwater. And the way that the smart contracts cannot call themselves, so what they invented is they created a liquidation market where they incentivize bots, the smart contracts or individuals, to come in with some of their own USDC, pay off the collateral, pay off the loan for that user, and then reclaim the collateral. So a liquidator comes in, gives some USDC, take over all of the user's collateral, and now we are solid. You may ask, what's the incentive? The incentive here is that they obtain the initial collateral at a discount. So instead of putting up $1 million worth of USDC to purchase that $1 million worth of ETH, they put in maybe 99% or 98%, and that's their profit. Now, the more underwater is the loan, the more incentives the lending protocol must give in order for someone to swoop in and give up that loan. And that's something like you can imagine, like normally this whole action occurs just the second the loan even approaches a liquidation point. And then that discount is basically compensated by whatever fees are involved when you first originate the loan. So the lending protocol is made whole, liquidator makes some money, user keeps their initial like borrowed assets, everyone is happy. But imagine there's a black swan event and ETH really drops under. Now, the liquidator comes in, gets a huge, let's say up to 20% discount on some protocols that we'll discuss shortly, gets that huge discount. But what happens with 20% discount on the lending protocol side? They have to hold on to it because no one's going to buy it, and it's called bad debt. Lending protocols hate accumulating bad debt. So with that knowledge in mind, let's talk about Euler protocol compromise. On March 13th, Euler Finance, a lending protocol, lost $197 million. And the reason they lost all of that is that they introduced a function, a method called donate to reserves. The method allows you to take your collateral and effectively burn it, and burn arbitrary amounts of it. So they created this feature because as you do borrowing and lending, you slowly start accumulating all sorts of junk, and you want to get rid of it. It was a cleanup function. What they didn't realize and account for, what happens to the loan if you start burning the collateral and arbitrary amounts of collateral? You can force your loan to go severely underwater. So you have this $1 million to $1 million loan, and you just burned $500,000 of collateral. Now your loan is underwater. Ooh, what are you going to do with that? Well, you're going to say, well, liquidators are going to come in, they're going to take a cut. But what's the benefit? What's the profit to the attacker? There is none. They just burned some of their collateral and they lost all of it now. Except the Euler protocol introduced another feature, which is called minting or leveraging. You can take your initial $1 million and you can leverage it up to 20 times. So now you have $20 million of debt and collateral, which you need to pay off. But you can do this for all sorts of things. You can enable short selling mechanisms and so on. So now you have a 20 million in collateral and the protocol, and you forced it to go underwater, and the protocol can give you up to 20% discount. So you can make 20% of 20 million is around $4 million. So sorry, 200 up to 400,000. So you can slowly accumulate the profits beyond what you initially. $20 million, 20%, $4 million. $4 million from the initial $1 million collateral. So you put in 1 million and you just 4x'd it. Pretty profitable. So the attackers were able to use that and abuse this feature to effectively go token by token that it was offered by this protocol and empty it, $200 million. But again, There's a reason why I'm talking about this protocol, because it's not so much the hack, it's what happens next. So let's talk about MEV bots. So briefly mentioned that there are these machines that are sitting watching all the transactions on chain for anything profitable. And you know what's a really profitable transaction? An exploit. You run this thing and you generate a whole bunch of profit. And such was the case here. So the attacker, on March 13th, 8:50 a.m. and 23 seconds, deployed an exploit contract. 4 minutes later, they performed the actual exploit. Why did they wait so long? What happened in those 4 minutes? Well, the second they deployed the exploit contract, a bot detected at a deployment, understood that it's profitable, and decided to redeploy it. So at 8:50, 35 seconds, that's exactly 12 seconds after the initial deployment, some machine simulated the whole thing, figured out it's an exploit, redeployed the contract, and then a few seconds later actually ran the exploit and front-ran the attacker. And all they had to do, they automatically went into the bytecode, just the sophistication of those things. They went into the contract, there was some access controls built in, they automatically replaced the bytecode to make sure that they can run this code themselves and try to extract the profit. They were not successful in this case, unfortunately, because the attacker built in all sorts of hard-coded addresses. So in the end, in this particular case, the MEV bot ended up sending money back to the attacker, for which they put out an on-chain message apologizing profusely. But the point is, not even attackers are safe from those things. They constantly sit on chain and they attack everyone. If it's profitable, exploit or not, they will target you. But the story does not end there. There is a happy end. The normal operating procedure after a DeFi hack occurs is that people start communicating with attackers. A lot of them are begging, like, oh, this was my entire life savings. Could you pretty please give me my money back, and so on and on. And so the way that a sample transaction looks like is you can put arbitrary data, including ASCII codes, in a transaction. And you can transfer like maybe 0.001 ETH to get attention from the attackers. In this case, it was an ASCII code from Euler Deployer. So this is the Euler people themselves. And they put in a message, again, standard operating procedure. Hey, you hacked us. Haha, good job. If you keep 90% of the profits, if you give us 90% of the profits and keep 10% for yourself, we promise not to pursue further legal action. And in this case, I, again, invite you to visit this link. We just put out a blog post, part 1, which dives into this thing. Fascinating story involving somehow North Korea and, backstabbing. This is DeFi land. This is pretty wild. The way that it culminates is the attacker put out a message, Jacob here, I'm sorry. I'm not sure what I did. I'm sorry for messing people's money, and ended up returning all of it. And that brings up another interesting point, is that this bounty thing works. Again, there are a bunch of volunteers that sit on chain, look for those hacks, and then they dox the hell out of the attackers. If by some mistake an attacker interacted with a centralized exchange where they can extract KYC, or in fact, if the attackers used MetaMask. So MetaMask is a common wallet, but if you recall back to when I was introducing the model, you don't just send messages directly to the blockchain. You go through centralized servers. And what do centralized servers have access to? Your IP addresses and your addresses, and they do collect them. So there are a lot of opportunities for the good guys to catch the bad guys. And worst case, there are rewards that are put up there. So in the case of the wormhole, they were able to reclaim it a year later. And in this case, they were able to effectively force the attacker to return all the assets. This happens more often than not. The same scenario played out a couple times since March incident. Okay, I'm not going to have time to talk about all the different exploit vectors. What I do want to point out, think of it as like OWASP top 10 style list. What I do want to point out is stolen private keys, the North Korean style hack where they go in and get all the keys and extract them from your contract. That's probably by far the most painful method. That said, the most frequently occurring method is probably price oracle manipulation. So remember that price oracle node that gives you price data? Well, people figure out all sorts of ways to manipulate the price data to make sure that they can do interesting creative arbitrage. So I invite you to learn more about these attack vectors. So overall, the state of DeFi security, we lost $3.7 billion in 2022. I do see the same attack vectors being used again and again. So there's definitely a gap in security staff, security development processes, and tooling. When DeFi project gets hacked, there's also a lack in incident response and monitoring processes. Oftentimes, these projects recognize that they were hacked because someone tweeted at them like, "Hey, project XYZ, you may want to look at this transaction." If that's your incident response, that's obviously lacking. But there's good future in that, in building those response capabilities. And then the other concern is just overloaded audit companies. There are specialized audit firms that exist that can look for those bugs, but there's so few of them. The professionals it's just so hard to bring someone into this field that most of them are booked for months and maybe a year ahead. So in the case of the Euler Finance, the bug that was introduced that resulted in the exploit, they added this feature after the audits were done. And quite simply because it takes months to get something audited, so they just added it. Okay, let's talk quickly about the state of BlockSec ecosystem, or if this sounds interesting to you, what you could build on. So I already mentioned audit companies. There are hundreds of them. I'm only listing just a few. Most of them popped up in the last year or two. So if you want to learn and pick up the skill, there's just such lack of them that individual auditors are making like pretty good living. Like I've seen people pick up this field maybe a few months ago and they're already full-time booked. Tooling could be built. There are bug bounty programs now like Immunify, Code4 Arena, all exist in the last couple of years. It's a brand new field. In terms of monitoring, again, in the last year or so, we've seen some solutions which use machine learning. They use just the ability to detect that transaction is malicious, decode a transaction, the risk algorithms that tell you that, hey, this lending protocol thing that you're building you probably want to look at it again. Insurance companies deal with inevitable hacks, so you can insure yourself in case there's a compromise, and so on. Wallet security exploded seemingly in the last few months, and that's basically dealing with how many people are getting phished. So they're creating these crypto firewalls, if you will, to alert user that something is amiss. Forensics companies and incident response they're just a few that are fairly old, but not too many new players. Let's talk about security community. Security community is amazing. They're Capture the Flag competition. There are dedicated conferences just for DeFi and blockchain security. There are newsletters, shameless plug, there's one that I'm running, blockthread.io, Rect, and others that go in details over exactly what's happening, who was compromised, how were they compromised, what's the latest research. People in the community are warm, they share knowledge, they welcome new folks joining us. That said, if any of that sounds interesting to you and you're kind of sick with the same old security stuff that you do, like no more XSSs, okay, yet another XSS, that's cool. You want to do something completely wild, hunt down people live on chain, explore this ecosystem as a smart contract auditor, on-chain investigator to figure out who the bad guys are, security engineers, incident responders are probably much needed. And with that, I'll give you some time for questions. Yes. What does that mean? The question is modular blockchain security. What does that mean? Sure. Layer 2 blockchains, effectively, Ethereum evolved as a primary blockchain, but everyone is using it, so the fees started going up. So people started introducing additional layers where you can offload some of the capacity to those layer 2 blockchains. That way you reduce the fees, increase the speed. There's some trade-offs with security sometimes, but it depends on the protocol. Some implement zero-knowledge proofs, which are very secure but kind of slow. Some implement centralized nodes, centralized sequences in architecture, and that's very fast but very centralized, so less secure. So all sorts of trade-offs. There's a resource, I'll remember and I'll tell you in a bit, that measures and compares them. Yeah, that's the future. That's where a lot of stuff is happening right now. Any other questions? All right. There's one coming up. There's one coming up in France. It's called DeFi Security Summit. I would recommend that one. That said, there are like Ethereum conferences which happening. There's one in San Francisco coming up, I think, in like later in the year, and they always have security track talks. So I would just go to a general crypto conference and just there's always someone talking about different threats and attacks. All right, thank you, folks.